Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 116th video in our Master Series and the second video in our group processing phase. So from the last video, we talked about a few key things when we get in here and how it's trying to simplify and why. So because of the majority of the people, what they're trying to do, and that doesn't mean that you're not going to get into some really wild stuff. The answer normally is that as you diversify into different things, that you have to change the way you do some things or do things a little bit differently, which normally isn't a lot of things that you don't normally think about when you're doing any type of a production, but they'll be more prominent in the thought process. So you just have to kind of bear with me on that one, because I had to make some decisions about how deep I was going to go into that, and then I thought I'd make a different series after this master series to deal with things like movie scores and huge symphonic productions and anything else like that. So anyway, basically what I want you to do is set up a saturation bus. This bus here is an analog console emulation bus, a bus for that, noise reduction bus, equalization bus, stereo field bus, mid-side bus, reverberation bus, a spatialization bus, an expansion bus, a compression bus, and a limiting bus. Those all routed from one to the next. Does that make sense? So you can go ahead and route the leveling bus to the next bus, route that bus to the next bus, route that bus to the next bus, and then on the last one here on this limiting bus, it's routed to this main bus that's routed directly to the main out. So, and on your main bus, put all of your analysis tools on, and try to keep in mind, I try to keep all those analysis tools open as I'm processing, so that as I'm processing, I can go through there and look at the phase of it, look at it on the scope, or look at it on the equalizer. I can look on my isotope stuff, my tonal balance meters, whatever that I'm working on. So if you don't see me all the time looking at it as I go through the process that we were talking about, I've always got to open it up in another window looking at it and checking all those things out before I move on to the next one. So just keep that in mind if I'm not showing it to you, if I get going along, because sometimes I've learned in teaching videos that, if I could just have you watch me do a whole complete big huge mix, that it would be maybe much better, and then I realized it wouldn't, and then I realized trying to cover certain things and then have you realize that, when you're actually doing it, that watching me do a whole mix, you're not going to get a good picture, and doing it the school book way, like we're trying to do here to some point, you're not going to get the whole picture, because I'm not going to be doing some things some of the time, and you may not, and that may not sink in that I am doing that. So just keep that in mind. So basically, before we get started, the saturation bus, saturation is a pretty simple concept. That saturation most of the time is to glue things together. A little bit of saturation can help glue things together a little bit, where things, and it can not only can it help kind of glue things together like reverberation does to some point, because it adds a harmonic texture to everything that's in the mix, which kind of blends it to get to some point. Now that can have a couple different effects. It can start to blend it together a little bit and glue it together, and it can soften it up a little bit so that it can kind of smooth out any roughness of the whole mix. And sometimes it can do the exact opposite and rough things up a little bit, give a little more bite to whatever is going on if you go a little heavy on it. So most of the time that's what the saturation bus is for, so you understand why we're putting it in there. Now that can directly work in conjunction with something like a console shaper, because the console shaper is, what its job is to do is to emulate a mixing console. So I don't know, you can get different ones out there because, people really will go out and spend thousands and thousands and thousands or hundreds of $1,000s on boards, bro, and outboard gear. Trying to has a little bit of drive on it, has some noise inherent in the system, crosstalk between the different tracks so that you getting bleed from stuff from all the tracks are kind of bleeding together to some point, that causes a crosstalk effect. Simple things like that people go spend thousands of dollars on, that they don't really understand that most of that stuff can be dealt with saturation, harmonic content, noise files, and things like that. And to them, it's like, well, I don't want to deal with all that. I want to emulate this analog console. So that's next because it can add those kind of textures of that. And things like, you can also put on a separate bus or add it to your saturation, like tape emulation or vintage vinyl emulation if you wanted, to have that really rough sound, like it went through 13 Toga Kagers, your nice Rush album or something, and you can. So basically between those two, those cover those kind of things. This one would cover any saturation and maybe analog or emulation, tapes emulation, anything like that. Or you can make a separate bus for it after your analog console emulation plug-in, any of those, to have it run through. So that's a possibility. And it's also possible to put that on at the very end of your mix before it goes to the main bus out. I normally do it here. That way I might have to readjust some of this other stuff because I've, done some of that work adding different harmonic content or adding, analog emulation from a console or tape emulation or anything like that. So after that, we go into the noise reduction, which most of the time at this point, I'm not running into RX6 and doing anything like that. Unless I've got a serious problem, I'm going to be doing some high, low pass filtering, and maybe some notch filtering to try to reduce any noise I might be having in the mix. And then I'm going to the equalization. So then I'm going to go through and do any equalization I might need to do, to the mix, and then I'm going to move on and deal with the stereo. So I'm dealing with the stereo field, trying to widen the stereo field and or maybe reduce it depending on, different sections of the song. So you might end up doing, automation of it and things like that. Mid-side, checking the mid-side. It's always a good idea to do that. You may not think so till you really listen to it. Then you realize, the difference of things going on the mid and side. So you want to kind of check it. I do really suggest this plug-in Sigmod because I've got it set up on here. It's really great because it's going stereo into this and then it's changing to mid-side, and I can put separate processors on either side of it to deal with any issues I have, and then that switches it back to right and left for me. It's a great plugin. It can do quite a few things, but I use it for, a couple things in particular. Then I'm going to the reverberation. I've got that same preset on that we put on the whole mix. I'm not putting a different reverb on there. This is the same reverb and echo effect that we were using on every one of the buses because it can help glue it together. If you went nice and light on all of them and you didn't overdo it, that now you can maybe add a little bit more to the whole mix. Then it will help, like the saturation, to kind of glue things together a little bit. Plus it makes it, combined with the amount, the light amount you put on the separate tracks, it's going to help it blend so that not only does it sound like all those instruments were recorded in the same place, but then you've mixed them in the same place. So it's almost like you're taking it and you've got an overhead. It's kind of like having an overhead of the whole production that you're adding that space to. Does that make sense? Because normally the overhead captures the band and or the drummer or whatever and the space. So that, does that make sense? So it's kind of that concept. And plus it can help blend it together a little bit and make it sound better. So if you went light on your processing with your reverberation, echo effect, and things like that, you can add a little bit more here to the whole production just to kind of blend things together so it really sounds like it was in the space that you were thinking of. And not only are those instruments recorded separately in that place, but they were also, you've got like an overhead here that's helping blend them together. Does that make sense? So it's a pretty simple concept. Then we're going to the expansion. Now, this a lot of times I may not fuss with at all, but there are times that I want to do some upward expansion from this point up. I want to do a little bit of upward expansion, or from this point to here, I want to do some upwards expansion of some type. Does that upwards compression and upwards expansion? So there's a place for that, because sometimes you get listening to the mix and it's like, well, you can either fix it here or you can go back and deal with it, on the individual tracks. A lot of times it will have already been dealt with, but it's a step I take a look at anyway. And then compression. I go into compression. Most of the time I've got compressors on here. Then I'm going to compress a little bit more, trying to achieve the desired compression. The way that I mix that, a lot of times it's really unnecessary, but I go through it to see just in case. Some productions I do use it, sometimes I don't. But I almost always put a maximizer on there. At the end of it, I put a maximizer on there, figure out where I want my output level at, and then I leave myself some headroom, and then I'm good to go. I maximize the track. Sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot, but basically it's like normalizing the track plus achieving a little bit of compression expansion, or compression limiting at the same time, that really kind of fills out the mix and brings it up to a good level, and then I'm good to go. And then at the end, I just normally put a limiter bus on there. I got it set real low, so it's just right up at close to zero, just to catch anything going on. And and if your limiter bus can't catch it, put two of them on there with the same settings. Between the two of them, if you don't have a really good compressor, it'll catch it. And that's it. And then that's normally ran into the main out. And then normally from there, I will check my levels, and I may or may not. This is set to -3 right now, and I may or may not drop that down some to give myself a little bit of headroom, because I normally leave my main out at 0 dB, and then I'll drop this down to where I've got at least about -3 dB when I go out, to where I, mix down for a master to take into a mastering, suite or something like that, or to send to a mastering engineer if I was going to do that. And it's a pretty simple concept. You can give yourself more headroom. Just remember, the more headroom you give yourself, the more of the lower end harmonic content, saturations, and things like that you really wanted built into the mix can get lost, because they get as you reduce the volume lever, that stuff gets cut out. So the lower levels will get cut out. So you want to be real careful of trying to give yourself a whole bunch of headroom, thinking you're helping somebody, that you're cutting out a whole bunch of really low, quiet harmonic saturations and distortions and things like that that were really making your mix sound good. So be real careful about that. So basically, we're ready to get into the processing. So once you've got those buses set up the way I've said, and you've got them routed the way I've said, that you're ready to start doing some processing. So in the next video, we're going to go directly from this leveling bus, and we're going to go into saturation, and we're going to take a look at our mix and see what we might do and what might need to be added in there, and go step by step, and then 3 steps forward, 1 step back, until we got a really good mix, so we can do a really good mix down, so we can get ready and go into mastering. So peace out, love. I hope you enjoyed the second video in our group processing phase, and I'll see you in the next video.